All right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm Dale, the Real Seeker, and just wanted to do a quick supplemental solo show for my Shroud of Turin series. So last time I did part 13, assessing the direct contact mechanisms, and I just wanted to do a short supplemental show because it occurred to me that I neglected to mention one of the major pieces of evidences that are alleged against, as a counter feature against the Shroud of Turin being formed through direct contact in terms of its bloodstains. And that's the fact that back in July of 2018, a couple of scientists, Luigi Garlocelli, we learned about him as a hyper-shroud skeptic who took one of the frottage or powder rubbing mechanisms, and another skeptic named Matteo Barini. Dr. Matteo Barini published a paper in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, a peer-reviewed science journal, called the Bpa approach to the Shroud of Turin. And in this approach, we'll get into it, they did a series of experiments that I'll describe in a moment, and they alleged to provide proof. It was all in CNN and all these popular level media outlets, proof the Shroud of Turin's a fake, because they did these experiments looking at the blood patterns or blood flows that happened on the experiments. And they said, well, this is inconsistent with the blood flows or blood patterns that we see on the Shroud. Therefore, the Shroud of Turin's bloodstains could not have been encoded onto the Shroud through naturalistic direct contact alone, and thus it must be a medieval fake or artistic image of some sort. And the media just mindlessly went with this and said, oh, there's proof and all this stuff. They did their thing. They're not critical thinkers, so that makes sense. But still, I think this is really important because it speaks directly to the falsity of the direct contact thesis. So I want to take some time to go over what were the experiments that they did and what they showed, and how does that relate to the Shroud of Turin? Does it in fact falsify that the Shroud of Turin's bloodstains could have been formed naturalistically through the direct contact mechanism or not? Now, one thing just to note here, even before we begin, let's pretend these experiments are correct. The conclusions that these hyper-skeptics have come up with as Shroud skeptics, they're all right. And yeah, the Shroud's bloodstains couldn't have been formed through naturalistic direct contact alone. Well, does this prove that the Shroud's bloodstains must have been painted or formed through some artistic mechanism, like being painted? No, come on, skeptics. Critical thinking here. No, because it just means that it could also just as equally mean that the Shroud's bloodstains were formed supernaturally through an extraordinary mechanism at the time of Jesus' resurrection. And this is proof that happened. I mean, as we go through more and more mechanisms, we're going to be looking at the historically consistent hypothesis of Mark Antonacci, for example, and Dr. Arthur Lynn's work. And, they propose a supernatural or an extraordinary / miraculous mechanism to explain the bloodstains. They vanished magically and then appeared on the Shroud and that sort of thing. And we'll get into more details on that. But I just wanted to point out kind of the lack of critical thinking by these Shroud skeptics who just mindlessly assume, well, if the Bpa results do prove that the Shroud's bloodstains couldn't have been encoded naturalistically through direct contact or from a real body, that means they couldn't have been supernaturally transmitted onto the Shroud of Turin in some way from a dead body onto the Shroud cloth in that way. We don't have to assume that, oh, well, that means that it was artistically formed by painting the bloodstains. And, as we showed in part 7 and 8, that's scientifically impossible to be the case anyways, given the Shroud of Turin's features. So basically, the Shroud skeptics have shot themselves in the foot here, because we know scientifically in part 7 and 8 that it can't be a traditional painting or artistic mechanism that naturally explains the Shroud's bloodstains. And if this Bpa analysis is correct, the Shroud's bloodstains couldn't naturalistically have been formed through direct contact. Well, what do we have left? An extraordinary or supernatural mechanism. And basically, these guys have just proven the resurrection of Christ, if the results are true. given we know that an artistic mechanism can't explain it. Painting doesn't work. But that said, let's take a look at what they actually did and go into that in a little bit more detail. Is it true that naturalistic direct contact alone can't explain the blood patterns or blood flow patterns that we see on the Shroud of Turin, given a direct contact mechanism? Okay, so first thing to do is, what is it? What was this Bpa analysis or blood pattern analysis approach that these Shroud skeptics applied to the Shroud of Turin? And essentially, they utilized about 6 experiments to test the Shroud of Turin's blood flows. Now, experiments 2, 3, and 4 utilized real human blood in their experiments, and that was added. They added citrate, or lemon juice, or what's called CPD, citrate phosphate dextrose, and that served as an anticoagulant on the blood. And they also added in saline adenine glucose mannitol, or SAGM for short, and that served as a preservative in the blood. So they had to add chemicals to this real human blood in order to try and make it match what we find on the Shroud of Turin, because if the blood coagulated, then you wouldn't get anything flowing or anything like that. Experiments 1, 5, and 6, on the other hand, used synthetic blood for convenience, and we'll get into more details about that as we go. Experiments 2 through 6, the blood flow was brought about at a desired location through the transfusion cannula. The volume of blood was controlled by use of a rolling clip on the tubing there. The scientists in the experiment claimed that there was effectively no difference between human blood and the synthetic blood used for these tests. We'll find out if that's true or a load of horse manure, but this is what they claim in their paper, that there was no difference. Okay. But just as a hint, with experiment number 5, for example, it was proven that the synthetic blood used was just way too runny. It was effectively red-colored water, which is nothing with the consistency of Jesus' blood, who would have been in hypovolemic shock at the time after being scourged and crucified and dehydrated and all of that. So I think we're going to find out there's some problems here. Synthetic blood, at the very least in this experiment, was not what the authors call quote-unquote superimposable with the experimental results using real human blood with the anticoagulant and that sort of thing. And additionally, because of the amount of the anticoagulant used in the real human blood, even those experiments, we'll find out, was a problem. The blood was just much too runny to be anything comparable to what the man in the shroud would have went through as a scourged and crucified victim in hypovolemic shock, and would have been dehydrated, and that the consistency of the blood on a person who would have had the wounds necessary to be transferred to a cloth, nothing comparable to the runny red water that these guys essentially used in their experiments, thereby cheating and giving results that would be not expected to cohere with what we see on the shroud. But yeah, that's a bit of an assessment, so let me get off that. I'm still explaining what these guys did. Okay, so experiment number 1 was about testing the back of the hand, the little blood flow coming from the back of the hand, the nail wound there, presumably a nail wound from crucifixion. And in order to investigate the shape of the nail wound on the hand, as well as those 2 short rivulets, they set up a preliminary test to simulate bleeding in contact with a wood surface. Basically a circular stain of 0.3 milliliters of synthetic blood was applied onto the back of the hand of a living volunteer, so they were using a human host here. And this was done to simulate the puncture-type injury. Pieces of wood with different textures, from bark to smooth finishes, were pressed onto the hand for about 10 seconds each time. And the resulting pattern observed, what did they get? Well, the results were not conclusive. And this is according to the skeptics themselves. They say because the wound is not clearly decipherable, and that by that they mean the location of where the nail entered the hand or palm or arm of the shroud man. we just see the exit wound, right? We see the back of the hands, which is the where the nail would have exited, or whatever object caused that wound exited. We don't see the entry point, but we know for certain it's not in the palms. But that's what he's talking about here when he's saying the results are not conclusive due to the fact that we don't know where the entry, we can't prove where the entry wound was, like where the nail went in exactly. But yeah, this is a huge problem because again, we'll deal with this in the assessment, but this is scientifically proven fact. It's not a medieval fake because the entry wound would be visible to be on the palm based on the location of the exit wound. It can't be in the palm, and that's totally different to the medieval artists of the day. None of them, crucifixion was outlawed in Constantine's day. He died in 337 AD, so no crucifixions happened after that in the Roman style. No one would have known how to do a historically accurate depiction of a Roman crucifixion exit wound on a wrist. Medieval artists wouldn't have known that the wrists were all part of the hand in biblical times, according to Jews. They considered the entire wrist and that the quote-unquote the hand. Medieval artists were totally ignorant, so they would have just, hand, the palm of the hand. That's what we get in all the pictures. So somehow this genius of a medieval artist got it historically correct, that it wasn't the palm of the hands that the nails went through. And additionally, he knew about the fact that the thumbs would retract and be hidden. He didn't depict thumbs. No other medieval artist in history was that much of a genius to depict the thumbs being forced in by the nail penetrating their median nerves or whatever it is, their nerves and that sort of thing. Okay, so yeah, so he did this experiment with the blood on the back of the hand. He did this about 4 times by pressing different types of wood to the back of that hand, which had blood applied to it for about 10 seconds each. Obviously, the wood was then removed, and the pattern of the blood left behind was observed to compare to what we see on the shroud today. Now, what's interesting here is that this experiment was evidently done with the hand in a horizontal position on the table. And if that's the case, if it was done horizontally, obviously that's nothing like where Jesus his arms would have and hands would have been in a vertical or semi-vertical position when he was nailed to the cross and that sort of thing. So the blood flows based on a horizontal, putting your hand on the table and then squashing a piece of wood to it would be nothing like what we would have with Jesus, where his hand was on a vertical position, nailed or pressed to the cross as he was bleeding. Basically what they got in the results of their experiments here were that they were vastly different than the vertical hand nailed to a piece of wood with the blood coagulating as it slowly exited from the wound while he was on the cross. So the results in the experiment were that the blood really went in all directions universally. It was squashed, lying horizontally. You put a piece of wood on top of it and press, it squashes the blood stain out in all directions equally. And this led the authors, bafflingly, to be confused. I mean, these are scientists. It's obvious, but these guys, these Shroud skeptics, were confused. They said, well, because of this, we were unable to, quote-unquote, unable to determine where the nail would have been located. But, it's just obvious for anyone with a functioning brain that in a real crucifixion victim, the blood runs down the back of the hand due to gravity when it's nailed on an angle, a vertical angle, to a cross. So, yeah, the location of the nail wound is clearly indicated on the Shroud man by the top of the blood stain. So, yeah, I think that's sort of a problematic thing in terms of Experiment 1. So that's kind of an overview of what they did with Experiment 1. What about Experiment number 2? And Experiment number 2, this is where they started testing for the forearm. The blood flows down the forearm of the Shroud man. And here they say, so a ballistic angle finder was used, measuring the arm to body or forearm to body angle of a standing subject from 0 degrees. So that's where the arm is parallel to the ground, horizontal. And also when it was perpendicular to the body, to 90 degrees of a vertical arm. So, like a right angle triangle. Your arm is up You'll see the picture there. And then they tried various angles, as you'll see in other pictures, corresponding to positions a person would allegedly have their arms when they're crucified and nailed to a cross. Now, it's important that the authors, the scientists, say that their experiments preclude any notion about there being ropes also, in addition to the nails, also tying the arms to the cross. Obviously, they didn't do, their experiments didn't take into account that option, just because I guess the Gospels don't show that, and also the Shroud man's blood flows don't seem to be consistent with ropes being tied around Jesus, in addition to the nails being there. So they didn't bother testing for that type of blood flows. And they also didn't test at all for the traditional artistic image of a crucifix with his arms stretched out on the crossbeam, and a position with the arms folded backwards at the elbow, and then bent around the crossbeam. For example, this is in the painting of the Mantegna Crocifessione in the 15th century. It was made around 1457 to 1459. So if you want to see what they're talking about there, they didn't bother testing for that kind of configuration or position on a cross because it's historically inaccurate to Jesus. He wouldn't have been crucified that way by the Romans. And the Shroud Man doesn't seem to be consistent with that type of crucifixion position either. So that's just ruled out. Whether you're pro-Shroud or Shroud skeptic, I mean, these assumptions are granted. We will grant that for the sake of argument. And finally, they also tested the forearm blood flows by lying down and getting into the position of the Shroud Man with his arms crossed over his groin and his upraised legs and that sort of thing. So this is to simulate his position, with both arms kind of folded in front of him with his hands crossed over his groin there, as depicted on the Shroud Man. So at the time of the body images were formed, that position, and they tested for that as well. Now, one thing just to point out very quickly, in terms of their experimental process, there was a huge issue or problem here, because when a crucifixion's victim's feet are nailed to the vertical wood column, well, then his knees would be positioned well forward of that column. This is just common sense. So, in the up position, so to speak, you kind of die by asphyxiation, a lot of experts say, on crucifixion. You have to press up in order to breathe in, because when you just lie flat or just lie there without pressing up, you can't breathe when you're on a cross. So this is what a lot of experts and medical experts have said when they've tested how crucifixion works. So this probably, if this was the case, this definitely would have been bringing in the middle and upper part of his body forward as well. So his back and his arms would then have been arched backward to nail his hands to the cross, the crossbeam there. So in this position, this isn't really comparable to what they did in their experiments, where they just had somebody standing on flat-footed on the floor, so to speak. So that's a potential discrepancy between that and the Shroud Man, and might, as we get to the assessment, might explain why there were some differences in what they got compared to what we have with the Shroud Man. Their experiments were flawed. We wouldn't expect them to be comparable because he's just standing on the floor testing this, whereas the Shroud Man was in a contorted position. He had to press up and down in order to breathe on the cross, when his feet were nailed in that position. So there's a difference there. Just be aware of that. Okay, so what about experiment number 3? So this is what we kind of briefly mentioned before when I was talking about experiment 2. This is where they tested, okay, now he's lying down in a supine position, in the position of the Shroud Man. At the time he was, the body images were formed on the Shroud. He's got his arms crossed, folded over his crotch or his groin, and his knees slightly upraised, just like we see with the Shroud Man on the Shroud of Turin today. And this was done to test out what pro-Shroud experts like Barry Schwartz or Frederick T. Zugby believed, whereby they said, well, maybe the body was washed partially or fully, and then the bloodstains oozed out. Remember, up to 4 to 6 hours after death, bloodstains can continue to ooze and then transfer to the cloth that way. So these experiments number 3 was kind of testing out this option for how the bloodstains formed on the skin and then transferred to the cloth through direct contact. Additionally, they tested at least 3 different angles of the table on which this guy was lying on. So, they tested in the first place where the table was placed at 3 angles. One was horizontal, 5 degrees clockwise. By that, we think they meant like 5 degrees downward at the head. Also, secondly, 5 degrees counterclockwise, so that's upward at the head. And for each inclination here, 2 postures were used. So there was one where the volunteer was just lying flat on the table, and then 2 where he adopts, as you're seeing on your YouTube video, that the Shroud Man position, knees up, head forward, arms over the the arms were always over the groin there, but he adopts more of what we see with the rigor mortis Shroud Man position in all of these inclinations. And that was done obviously to simulate rigor mortis, as we see with the Shroud Man. So so then a small amount of blood was allowed to drip from the cannula attached at the back of the left hand. And the conclusion of their experiments was that the pattern of blood running off the top of the back of the left hand there, it did not match the pattern of rivulets as they appear on the left hand and forearm of the Shroud Man. But I mean, again, just kind of as a quick way of assessment, I mean, this is obviously not surprising because it's obviously usually believed that the left hand and the forearm rivulets, as we see on the Shroud Man, well, those were formed on the body when it was in the vertical crucifixion position on the cross. These weren't formed when the body was in a supine position. And this goes with if you take a partial washing thesis like I do, for example. I think that there is a partial washing, but there wasn't a full washing. So it's not the case that all the wounds, as we see, were the result of oozing or that sort of thing after he was put in the shroud. Some of these bloodstains were from back when he was up on the cross. These experiments are kind of like testing out all or nothing deals. There's no nuance or complication, whereby some bloodstains were formed at different times and in different positions. Not only that, but when Jesus was being carried to the cross, maybe some bloodstains reflect the positions of his body while he was being carried there. So yeah, it's not quite as simplistic a scenario as this experiment tests for. It's a falsification test at best. For only one type of option, whereby all the bloodstains were formed while he was in that supine lying down position in the tomb. And most pro-shred experts don't go for that. Okay, so moving on, what about experiment number 4? So here they went to the same layout as they did with experiment number 2, testing the blood flow pattern down the hand. And for about 4 centimeters out, I think it was, they wanted to test the angles of the blood flows. And by doing these experiments, they kind of concluded that those 2 short rivulets on the back of the left hand on the Shroud Man require about a 45-degree angle during crucifixion at the time these blood things were flowing. 45 to 50-degree angle, and that's consistent with what we found. Remember, Pierre Barbet did actual experiments crucifying people and that sort of thing, and seeing the angles. He got about a 35-degree angle for the arms to be outstretched on. These experiments are saying, well, it should be about 45 to 50 degrees, and this is consistent with what the pro-shroud people have been saying all along. Thank you, science. You've confirmed shroud research. But these skeptics are quite sly, so they kind of measured that. In order, the angle needed to create the blood stains on the forearms, that part of the arm between the elbow and the wrist. In order to get that to match the Shroud Man, that would have to be greater than 80 degrees, just so that these 2 blood stains, the one on the back of the hand and the one on the forearm, would have aligned. And since they don't, they would have had to have formed at different times, because they were obviously formed with different angles of vertical of the arms being outstretched, one at 80 degrees when the forearm was formed, and one at 45 to 50 degrees. Now, in the first place, there are problems with this. I mean, the quote-unquote different times conclusion here appears really to assume that the two short rivulets on the back of the left hand and the bloodstains on the outside of the forearms came from the same source, the same wound. Namely from that exit wound on the back of the hand when the nail pierced it. That's an unproven assumption of these skeptics. We don't know that necessarily, right? This assumption is it's not discussed or proven in any way in this so-called peer-reviewed article. But yeah, beyond this, there are several options to explain this alleged inconsistency. Between the two short rivulets on the back of the hand and then the blood flows on the outside of the forearm. So in the first place, look, the blood at about 45 degrees may result from the nail when it was initially pounded through the wrist into the wooden crossbeam called the patibulum. And as the body lay on the ground before the crossbeam was even lifted onto the vertical column to the forearm on the cross. Then the blood on the forearm was formed at the greater than 80 degree angle may result from the blood from the wrists as the body was hanging vertically on the cross. Bada boom, bada bing, you've been destroyed, skeptics. You've never even thought of that, did you? Maybe they were formed at different times, namely the rivulets on the back of the hand, when that nail, he was lying down on the cross and they were first nailing his arms to the cross, those formed. Then they raised the cross, and then the blood flowed out of that same wound at a greater than 80 degree angle as they... Now, it's important to note that despite the claims of these Shroud skeptics about it needing to be a greater than 80 degree angle, most world's experts and blood analysis, pattern, and forensic experts know that the bloodstain evidence has generally been interpreted to indicate that the arm angles for the forearm bloodstains was between about 55 and 65 degrees, not greater than 80 degrees, as Garlic Shelley and his buddy are saying here. But that leads into another option, because obviously it's generally believed that during crucifixion, the victim, as I said, would be moving up and down on the cross just in order to breathe, prevent himself from asphyxiating and gain some wiggle room for his lungs. So by pushing up on his nailed feet and pulling up on his nailed wrists, this would allow him to breathe until the muscles in his legs became so exhausted that he couldn't do it anymore, and then he would die by asphyxiation. So in the resting position, his arms could easily be at the 45 degree angle mark, but in the up position, the angle in the forearm, it becomes much greater as he pulls his body up. In some cases, it's been shown to be even greater than 80 degrees, perhaps. So it may be explainable in this way. He was in the down position, the rivulets formed on his hand at a 45 degree angle, or, whatever it is, 45 to 50 degree angle mark. Then he pushed up to breathe, and his arms were at a greater than 80 degree angle, or between 55 to 65, as most experts say. But again, even assuming the worst for these skeptics and saying it was greater than 80, well, that's still scientifically proven to be possible when he was breathing in the up position. So that would explain the different angles of these bloodstains on the forearm versus on the back of the left hand with the two rivulets. Nothing in the scientific article even goes into this historically proven fact or this medically proven fact or addresses this and how that can possibly account for the alleged inconsistency that these skeptics give. What's more, here's another one. Here's another option. Now, these Shroud skeptics never even considered about bleeding from the front side of the nail wounds, the entry wounds, right, in the wrists. That was just not considered for these skeptics because that's not shown on the Shroud man's image. But that doesn't mean that bloodstains present on the Shroud couldn't have come from the front side of the nail wounds. So, for example, in the crucifixion position, the body may have been in a somewhat bowed out or an arched position, as we kind of mentioned before, due to the nailing of the feet to that vertical wood column. It's possible, historically plausible, that the crossbeam, or this patibulum, was not put in a notch in the wood column, but was rather attached to the front surface of the vertical beam. So that, this would mean that the front of the crossbeam was kind of further forward than the front of the vertical column itself. This makes perfect sense because we have zero evidence of vertical abrasions on the back of the Shroudman, on the dorsal image. But yet we do have abrasion marks. Again, this isn't a minimal relevant feature, but many pro-shroud and forensic experts have identified abrasion marks on his nose and around his shoulder areas and stuff like that from when he was carrying the crossbeam. So if he was moving up and down, breathing on the cross, and his back was rubbing up and down against the vertical wood column, this would cause abrasions that would be detectable on the Shroudman today, but yet they're not there. So this kind of indicates he was kind of pushed forward a bit away from his back was pushed forward away from the wood of the vertical part of the cross, wood beam of the cross. And if this is the case, if his body was bowed in this way and when he was up on the cross, it could have caused the arms to be angled out from the cross. And if this is the case, then it might cause the blood from the nail entrance wounds, not the exit wounds, but the entrance wounds at the front of the wrists to drain around the wrists and then down the outside of the forearms as shown on the shroud. So really the shroud skeptics didn't even consider that maybe the two short rivulets on the back of the left hand and then the bloodstains on the forearms would not have had to have occurred at different times, but they could simply just result from different bleeding locations, and that's why they're different. One from the entrance wounds and the other from the exit wounds of the nail around the wrists. That didn't even occur to these skeptics. They didn't even think to test for these types of things at all, by their own admission. So that's a huge glaring problem for the skeptics, making their unwarranted conclusions against the shroud here based on these differing angles of the blood wounds. One final option here to mention is that, well, maybe the two short rivulets of blood at the wrist might result from the process of removing the nails from the wrists or taking the body down from the cross. I kind of hinted at that before. So yeah, the blood on the forearms might result from the process of removing the nails, for example, from his wrists when they were taking his body down. Or maybe it kind of massaging the shoulders and arms to release the rigor mortis in order to allow his arms to be brought down over his groin. Maybe this resulted in the blood flows on the forearms being what they are in terms of the greater than 80-degree angle, allegedly. So yeah, as you can see, the experiments in terms of the bloodstain, the two rivulets on the back of the left hand, as near the wrist, as well as the bloodstains or blood flows down the forearm, have not been proven to be inconsistent with what we have with the Shroud of Turin and the Shroudman on those images there, because their experiments are just utterly flawed. In the first place, experiment number 1, totally worthless, not in the proper position. Experiment number 3, again, falsifies a position that no pro-shred expert really today advocates for in terms of how the specific bloodstains on the forearm and back of the left hand were formed. Everybody admits that came when he was on the cross, not lying in the tomb in a supine position. So 1 and 3, worthless in terms of falsifying the direct contact hypothesis. What about experiment 2 and 4, which are linked? Testing the blood flows and the angles of that, as well as matching up the angles of the blood flows between the two rivulets on the back of the hand compared to the blood flow on the outer forearm. One being at a 45 to 50 degree, 45 to 50 degree angle, another to greater than 80 degree angle according to the authors. Is that a problem? No. We've got at least 4 equally probable explanations as to why the data came out that way, and these Shroud skeptics in their peer-reviewed science journal didn't even bother thinking of how to test or how to falsify for that. So all 4 of these experiments testing the bloodstains on the wrist and forearm, completely worthless. We cannot rule out even a naturalistic direct contact thesis on this basis. Not to mention the fact that, remember, the blood they were using was essentially so watered down. It was essentially red-colored water. It was way too runny. That it was nothing to do with what the blood would have, the consistency of the blood of the Shroud Man, whoever he was, whether you think he was crucified or not, no matter what, he was damaged if we're positing an ordinary naturalistic direct contact mechanism here. And he would have been in hypovolemic shock. He would have been dehydrated. I mean, from all these wounds that created the bloodstains, there's no way the blood that they used would have been consistent with the blood of the Shroud Man, as we can just see depicted from his wounds on the Shroud Trin. Who cares whether that's Jesus or whether you want to say he actually was crucified or not? Whatever happened to this guy, dear goodness sakes, the wounds prove that we know scientifically the blood would not be consistent with what they were using as blood in their experiments. So total failure. Sorry, skeptics, you'll have to try again better next time. And guess what? They're not done. They've got 2 more experiments, so they're going to try. And these are on different bloodstains. The chest wound, that bloodstain that separates blood and water in the Gospel of John, where he was stabbed. Jesus was stabbed through the heart to prove that he was dead by that Roman centurion. We have that blood flow proven on the Shroud of Turin itself. But these Shroud skeptics want to take that away from Christians. So they want to say, well, there's no way that stain could have been formed through direct contact, because we tested it out and our results were inconsistent with what we find, the blood flows we find on the Shroud of Turin. So let's get into the final 2 experiments, experiment 5 and 6. And what did they do here on this front? Okay, so experiment number 5 focused specifically on the chest wound. And essentially, in their own words, what they did for this is they took tested the spear wound on the chest by taking a sponge with the same dimensions, about 6.5 centimeters by 2.5 centimeters by 3.5 centimeters, as the wound, and then attached that to a long handle. And that was soaked in synthetic blood here, not real human blood for this test. And then they attached that to the corresponding area on a mannequin. So they didn't use a human body, they used a mannequin torso. When the mannequin was in a vertical standing position, vertical rivulets flow only on the front of the torso, not the back, in a direction that is congruent, they admit, is congruent with the Shroud image. And they say that their findings seem to be consistent with the general interpretation of the man in the shroud being pierced with a spear while he was hanging from the cross. However, they add this caveat that rivulets obtained during the experiment run independently without creating a large filled stain, as a single solid filled stain as seen in the Shroud. This is what the skeptics say. Now, obviously, this has problems. Number one, they're using a mannequin. That's not going to be consistent with human skin, especially the condition that Jesus was in. Again, the synthetic blood they used was just runny water, red-colored water. It was not consistent with the blood at all. So in a sense, it is amazing that it matched the Shroud, in general, matched the Shroud's bloodstains to some degree. But again, there was that difference that they got where it wasn't just one solid filled-in bloodstain, as they say. This is really the Achilles heel of this experiment. It's just totally irrelevant because the blood's not consistent. But then they come to experiment number 6, and this one is interesting. This is where it's again the chest wound, but they're testing the dorsal side image, the lumbar region of the back, the bloodstains along the lower back of the Shroud Man. And they used the same process as they did in experiment number 5, got a sponge, bloodied, put it on a little stick, and jabbed it into a mannequin torso. But this time the mannequin torso was lying flat on the surface and covered with fabric. So the experiment was repeated after the surface on which it was lying had been tilted about 5 degrees, both clockwise and counterclockwise. So they tested based on 3 degrees of inclination, right? 5 clockwise, 0 degrees, and then 5 degrees counterclockwise. And the rivulets from the chest wound flowed sideways and posteriorly to the seppular region, where they just created this single large pool, which was then absorbed by the fabric and of course the corresponding imprint on the body. So yeah, the general pattern is in these skeptical scientists' words is quote unquote therefore rather different from the Shroud of Turin, where it is possible to recognize the so-called quote unquote blood belt as multiple winding lines across the lumbar region. The Shroud of Turin or the Shroud Man's dorsal image doesn't present this just single solid blood pool that the scientific experiments got, the skeptics got with their experiments. The Shroud Man has this blood belt, as experts call it. But once again, problems with this, it just was with experiment 5. I mean, this is just ridiculous. If you're a scientist, no one would believe that this is an accurate representation of what would happen to the Shroud Man, and therefore you can't use it to falsify. Again, the viscosity of the blood is all wrong. It's just running water. And of course, we would expect that to just run down the side and then pool onto the shroud, but that's not what happened with a real human being, bloodied human being in that case. They had the wrong blood flow rate. They used a plastic mannequin torso instead of actual human skin. No arms were there to be in contact with the body torso and help to redirect blood flows. There was just no process in this alleged test or falsification test to try and explain how the arms might contact with the body torso and redirect blood flow there. So there's lots of problems just in general. Yeah, let me get into some degree of assessment in terms of this experiment and various explanations as to why there was a difference here. Okay, so the first option might be, well, look, the front image on the shroud shows that while the body was on the cross, the blood flowed vertically down from the side wound. But then, when the body was placed into the tomb on a horizontal orientation, the blood ran down the side of the lower chest. So, yeah, the area just below the patches next to the side wound appears to show that the blood flowed down the chest several centimeters below the spear entrance location. So this is what we see on the Shroud Man. And, you know, this may have been caused by the blood that initially exited the wound when he was up on the cross, having dried while the blood was still on the cross, while the body was still on the cross. Then all of a sudden it was redirected. The subsequent blood was redirected, probably including other body liquids, right? The Bible tells us in the Gospel of John it wasn't just blood, it was blood and water when this happened. So this kind of caused the subsequent blood flow to flow around the lower chest, well below the location of the side wound. This is just due to the normal curvature of the lumbar region of the back. Also, additionally, the skin would probably not have been in contact with the cloth below the body at this time. So, you know, therefore the blood could flow across the lower back, just like we see with the Shroud Man. So yeah, the blood stain on the dorsal image is really in good agreement with this kind of scenario. So there is no inconsistency. The Shroud skeptics just lack any and all imagination. They're not conceiving of realistic scenarios. They're just desperate to reject the Shroud evidence no matter what. They're probably getting, as Barry Schwartz has mentioned, that, you know, these atheists get paid money anonymously behind the scenes to falsify the Shroud. So they're not doing true science. They're not interested in the truth. They're wanting to. They have an agenda. They just want to falsify it. It seems, no matter what. They're not trying to think up of these various scenarios. But that's not all. What about? Think about this. The experiment for the body in a horizontal position, as in experiment number 6, this was done using a plastic mannequin without arms. But the Shroud Man clearly had arms. So imagine those on the front side of the body with the hands joined over the groin. Well, if this was the configuration, then the arms might have redirected some of the blood and watery fluid toward the lower back, just as we see with the Shroud Man. Perfectly consistent. This wasn't even considered by the Shroud skeptics. Additionally, another bunch of different problems and things to think about, but examination of the blood stains on both sides of the lower back may indicate that the source of the blood was coming from both sides of the body. So this is kind of similar with the hand wound. It's not just from the side wound itself. Now you might ask, what on earth could cause this or something? Well, think about it. Perhaps this blood was coming from the front, the entrance wound of the spear in the wrists, and then running down the inside of the forearms, the sides that are not visible on the shroud as well, and then dripping off the elbows. So this may have happened during the massaging of the shoulders in order to release it from rigor mortis and put it into the burial position. In the process of bringing the arms down to cover that groin area, then maybe some of the blood got on that way. It also may have happened while the body lay in the tomb. So yeah, there's some options there, right? Because residual rigor mortis could have kept the forearms sufficiently above the body to allow the blood to run down the inside of the forearms there until it dripped down from the elbows. So yeah, that's an option these skeptics didn't even consider. Additionally, the blood flow on the lower back could have been caused by symmetrical injuries on both sides of the body, in the kidney areas, for example, due to the severe scourging that this person, the Shroud Man, obviously underwent. And as we know, Jesus just happened to undergo that as well. A few more things to mention. And remember, that backward bowed posture that we see the Shroud Man, the body, the arch of the back that he would have been in while on the cross, that too could have allowed blood to flow from the side wound to the lower back. And that's been scientifically documented as well. Another option, some pro-shroud guys have suggested that there is evidence that a loincloth was possibly held in place by a belt wrapped around the waist of the Shroud Man. So during crucifixion, this might have caused some blood to flow along that belt, the belt to the lower back, if he was wearing this kind of loincloth while he was up there. And obviously, this blood could have come from blood dripping down the outside of the forearms, dripping off the elbows, and then onto the lower back. And due to the curvature of the body, again, it would create the Shroud Man blood stains going across the lower back, unlike what we see just dripping off into a single large pool, as was seen in experiment number 6 in the Shroud Skeptics experimentation here. One last point to mention about this is, look, blood flow onto the lower back may have occurred during the process of removing the body from the cross. There's also this thing when they were transporting the body to the tomb or burying the body in the tomb. We don't know. We don't fully understand all of the processes that were involved with the Shroud Man's body when putting him into the shroud. So it's a scientifically proven fact that corpses can and do bleed spontaneously from their wounds hours after the fact. But corpses will also bleed much more if they're mobilized or they're moved in some way. There have actually been some researchers who believe that the blood stain in the lower region of the back probably occurred when the body was placed onto the shroud. And one reason for this is because that the blood stains seem to show directionality, so to speak. They have, the blood was, you can almost see the blood was flowing this direction. There was a relative displacement between the body and the shroud there. And that's displayed by this directionality that's apparent. So yeah, there's just lots of options that these shroud skeptics, again, in their short-sightedness and desperation to disprove the shroud, they didn't even consider or account for or test for these other equally probable or plausible scenarios that are live options and could have happened historically to the Shroud Man, and would therefore explain why the Shroud Man's blood flows on the back and chest wound are different than what they got in their experiments. Their experiments were inadequate to falsify the direct contact hypothesis, even as an ordinary naturalistic mechanism. Direct contact alone and the laws of nature, they can explain these blood flows. Nothing in the Bpa analysis is able to falsify that. So this is just an utter failure. That said, it is respectable. I mean, these guys did do scientific experiments that they have empirical findings and evidence that do need to be grappled with, and they do shed some light on things that wouldn't have worked, and give us some kind of progress in terms of understanding how the Shroud Man's blood flow images might have been formed or couldn't have been formed through naturalistic direct contact mechanisms. So it's not totally I don't want to say, oh, it's totally irrelevant or worthless. It's only worthless in the sense that we can't really falsify an ordinary naturalistic mechanism of direct contact in accounting for the bloodstains based on the Shroud Man's bloodstains being inconsistent or different than the blood flow patterns exhibited in these scientific experiments. You just can't make that conclusion. You're totally unwarranted and illogical and irrational if you even attempt to do that. So yeah, just to wrap up our overall assessment and summarize kind of our assessment and evaluation of these blood flow pattern or blood pattern analysis experiments and what we can glean from them. And here are some of the problems with it. So problem number one, we mentioned straight from the beginning, is look, the synthetic blood and or even the human blood that was used in all of these experiments containing this anticoagulant and or preservatives would simply not have had the same viscosity or flow behavior as real human blood without an anticoagulant or dilution coming from a natural human body. It would not have accurately reflected the blood flow of a human being in the state that we can scientifically observe the Shroud Man would have been in if he was a real human corpse and he had these injuries and the blood was flowing from real life injuries in this way. Yeah, the blood used in the experiments appears to be much too runny. As Mark Antonacci says, it's essentially red bloody water. That's the viscosity of it, and that's just, yeah, it's just way too fluid to be of any significance. Secondly, the blood flow on human skin. The fact that they would use a mannequin, that's totally irrelevant. I mean, human skin has many differences from a plastic skin mannequin that make a difference in terms of how the blood would flow in skin. I mean, skin's got pores, it's got hair, it's got wrinkles, and swelling as well. He was injured. We've got proof of swelling on the Shroud Man, evidence of swelling in that. And that would all affect, not to mention products on him, like sweat, dirt, dried blood products. These would all affect the blood flow pattern that we see, and it would definitely, we wouldn't expect it to be the same as the blood flow pattern on a clean, smooth, pristine plastic mannequin torso. Ridiculous, skeptics, ridiculous, if you think that this is in any way comparable. I mean, come on, you're supposed to be scientists here, right? And this especially is the point, applies to the point at which the blood would flow or drip off skin compared to plastic. There's a demonstrated difference on that front too. Okay, next up, the blood flow rates were not the same. The rate at which the blood was flowing would not have been the same either. So, you know, for example, in the experiments, experiments 5 and 6, they compress a sponge onto the side of the plastic mannequin, and with the blood containing the anticoagulant and the preservative, well, that would just not produce the same flow rate as a spear thrust into the side of a dead man, with, you know, the blood not containing any anticoagulant or preservatives at all, or at the very least, not to the same degree that these guys have put in. So that's a major problem. Additionally, the angles of the blood flows were simply not correct. You know, a hand in experiment 1, remember the hand was flat on the table horizontally. That does not simulate a hand in a vertical position at all. Experiment 1 is worthless. Throw it out. And a person standing up, remember the person in one of the experiments was just standing up in experiment 2 and 4. They were just standing flat on the floor. This probably doesn't simulate the shape of a person's body during crucifixion, where their feet would have been nailed and they would have been kind of bowed out with their arch in their back away from the cross, sticking away from the cross to some extent. Next, regarding the nail through the wrist. Remember, we found that only blood flow from the back or exit wound was even considered in these experiments, and they don't consider the entry wound or blood flow from the entrance of the nail wound playing a role on the bloodstains encoded on the shroud at all. Major mistake, skeptics. That's a major mistake right there. They should have considered that and taken that into account when they were testing whether it was possible or plausible for this mechanism to work. Another thing is the plastic mannequin, the torso there, again, had no arms. Remember, that was a huge factor. You know, that would definitely, when he was in the Shroudman was in the horizontal position, he had bare arms next to the side wound. This would interact with the body torso, and that could affect blood flow from the side wound, for example. And that was not tested for at all in these experiments. Utter failure. Next up, the scientific experiments were only performed on the blood flow from the back of the left hand and from the side wound. Those are the only two blood flows that they tested for and tried to compare. They didn't, let alone all of the hundreds of other bloodstains and scourge wounds on the shroud. They only tried to reproduce two. You know, experiments that were not performed on blood flow from the front of the left hand, the head, the feet, or the scourge marks on the back and front of the man's torso. You know, we can't make this conclusion. They have no idea how it will perform on these other marks and that sort of thing. And then final point here is that the alleged discrepancies assume that the bloodstains that show that the forearm were due to bleeding from the back, exit wounds at the wrist, and that the bloodstains on the lower back were due to bleeding from the side wound. There is no evidence, zero, zip, doodah, zippity doodah, evidence given for this. It's just an assumption on the skeptic's part. But if these assumptions are not valid, then they basically have no basis for claiming any discrepancies at all. Throw their experiments in the garbage. They're irrelevant to disproving the Shroud of Turin in any way. You know, like we said, we went over various possible options for differing sources for different blood flows. Maybe entrance versus exit wounds and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that these are pretty serious critiques as to the results that they got. Let me just take a quick scan of Mark Antonacci's article and see if he has something that I missed here. Yeah, so Mark, in his counter article, which is on my blog, he also mentions, don't forget the motion of the body while it's on the cross affecting blood flows, you know, breathing in and out, pushing up and down, creating different angles of blood flow as he was trying to breathe and not die from asphyxiation, as a lot of medical experts say is how you died when you were crucified ultimately. When you lost the strength to push yourself up and breathe in, you died from asphyxiation. Another good point that Mark Antonacci raises that wasn't in Bob Rucker's article here is that there's the Shroud skeptics made a point that there's a gap in the blood flows between the wrist and the lower forearm for the man in the shroud. Yeah, I mean, so what? Are you serious? You think that this is a good point? These are supposedly scientists who should know better. I mean, everyone who looks at the full-length frontal image can tell that the man's barriers have intentionally placed his hands to cross over his groin, just as first-century Jewish tradition says you should, to cover up his modesty. So, yeah, obviously they grabbed his hands and massaged his shoulder and then grabbed his hands and brought them back down from the position in which he died on the cross to cover over his groin area for burial. This gap area is totally explainable with an ordinary naturalistic direct contact thesis. I mean, yeah, they would have had to grab his hands, which were in rigor mortis, and force them to be lowered into that position and to stick them there by the time he was buried. So yeah, this gap in the blood flows, I'm just shocked that the Shroud skeptics think like, see, this proves it couldn't have been direct. No, this proves it is direct contact. A medieval painter would never paint a gap in his blood flow. He would just be so dumb, he would paint it all the way through. But because it covered a real human body, then, okay, they had to grab his arm, and that kind of wiped away some of the blood as they were lowering it into position. Yeah, that's an additional point that Mark Antonacci makes in his article that I think is good. Another last point that Mark Antonacci brings up that Bob didn't bring up in his article is, look, it's kind of going back to the Shroud skeptics' inability to duplicate or even understand the presence of the horizontal blood flows across the small of the back. So this is experiment number 6. And this is, Mark says, well, look, this contributes to their erroneous conclusions regarding the blood in the shroud. And Mark mentions this interesting time he asked STURP scientist, Dr. Don Lin, one of the world's experts, to kind of explain the horizontal flow across the low of the back of the man in the shroud. And he explained that STURP scientists actually did scientifically proven experiments whereby they poured water, which, okay, so great. So that's comparable to their runny blood, right? Down the right side of a young man who was voluntarily suspended in the vertical position that the man in the shroud appeared to be in when he died on the cross. Dr. Lin said that the water not only ran down the front of the volunteer's right side, but that it also curved when it got to the narrower, lower part of the front hip and went around his bowed out lower back, or arched lower back. So this is a scientific experiment proving the opposite of these skeptics, saying that it does, if you put him in the proper position, as the shroud man depicts on the cross, then it does create this blood belt that's seen on the shroud man, and doesn't, and falsifies these irrelevant experiments as being meaningless compared to the shroud man. Now obviously with that, he makes this cautionary note. Look, well, no one can say for certain how the post-mortem fluids ran across the lower back of the man in the shroud. Nevertheless, STURP's experiment here indicates that it could have happened and shows us how it could have happened while the man was in the vertical position. So yeah, I think that's something to mention right there. We've got credible STURP scientists have done scientific experiments of their own, proving that actually these results aren't true, and that blood flow patterns representative and consistent with what we see on the Shroud of Turin are in fact possible, not only can happen, but do happen in real life. So that's kind of devastating for these shroud skeptics using the Bpa analysis to say, oh, the shroud's a fake. So yeah, that's it. That's all I can see here. So my ultimate conclusion, look, I'm not biased. I don't believe in the direct contact hypothesis for explaining the shroud's bloodstains, right? I don't believe that an ordinary naturalistic mechanism can explain it, or at least I think it's improbable. I'm about 55%. When we get to my conclusions, I'll let you guys know that. But just, I'm about 55 to 60% convinced that I think it's improbable that ordinary naturalistic direct contact mechanisms alone, without any supernatural or extraordinary mechanisms being involved, could explain the Shroud of Turin's bloodstains overall. And I kind of covered that in part 13 when I went over the direct contact hypothesis. And I'll go over it again when I do my overall conclusion for criterion B. So I don't have a bias in the game here. I'm not someone that needs to say that, well, direct contact naturally has to explain it. Otherwise, it was the bloodstains must have been painted and artistically formed. No, I go for a third option, the supernatural or the extraordinary mechanism option in explaining the bloodstains. But nevertheless, as a neutral observer, it seems obvious that the Shroud skeptics haven't done what they said they've done. They haven't disproven that natural direct contact can explain the blood flow patterns that we see on the Shroud of Turin. And that's disappointing to me as a Christian, because I wanted them to succeed. If they succeeded in this way, if they actually falsified that the blood could have been encoded through direct contact in these experiments, and given that I've falsified that artistic painting techniques or anything artistic methods can create the bloodstains, then that would be absolute proof that a miracle took place in forming the bloodstains. So I wanted these guys to succeed. It would be better for my argument if they had. But unfortunately, I do think that, pro-Shroud experts that take people like Barry Schwartz and Ray Rogers and ones that think along those lines. They're not Christians. They don't think it was formed miraculously. But they do think it belonged to Jesus, and it was Jesus' bloodstains on the shroud, and it got there through direct contact. I don't think we can rule out that the Barry Schwartzes of the world are correct, at least not on the basis of these Bpa experiments that were done. And I wish we could have, like I said, I wish we could have, because then I could say, aha, direct contact doesn't do it. We've got experimental proof. Thanks, skeptics. And likewise, we've got absolute proof that artistic techniques can't explain the bloodstains either. Voila, miracle. My job would have been done. I could have just cited Shroud skeptics that go against the artistic techniques, against them. And then I could have cited the artistic Shroud skeptics against these BPA experiments against the direct contactors. And my job was done. But unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. So yeah, that's my take on this. It's a failure. I don't include this in my minimal relevant features approach as a counter feature because it doesn't fit that criterion. The Bpa analysis, the experiments, don't provide me with more evidence on a balance of probabilities. It's not 51% or more probable direct contact can't explain these and or that a body wasn't involved in the formation of the Shroud's bloodstains or something like that, as these guys want to claim. And because their claims are improbable given the evidence, I can't include it as a counter feature in my minimal relevant features approach. As you remember, I have strict standards. So when it's a positive MRF, an MRF, minimal relevant feature that supports my argument for the miraculous nature of the images, it's got to meet the true. It's got to have strong evidence in favor of it, proving it's true on a balance of probabilities or more. And also, additionally, there has to be a consensus whereby 2/3 of the Shroud scholars and experts accept it as an undisputed fact. With the I also include the counter features to prevent against selection bias, and there I have lesser standards. The consensus is irrelevant to me of Shroud experts. All that matters to me is, look, does the evidence prove this is true on a balance of probabilities? And if it does, then I include it. I include it in my, or at the very, even 50-50, I would include it in my minimal relevant features approach to hurt my argument for the Shroud's miraculous nature. But unfortunately, these BPA experiments and the conclusions from them don't meet that threshold. I mean, it's very improbable to my mind that these experiments do anything to disprove a direct contact thesis or prove that they must have been artistically formed or anything like that. So utter failure and dismissed. That's it for that. Okay, cool. Just before we go, I do want to just kind of recap some of the things I said in my Part 13 show about direct contact and about the bloodstains. I wasn't able to show pictures and that sort of thing, so I want to show, because I was in a rush, I didn't have time to edit the video and put in kind of helpful visual images, and I think that would have really helped you guys with what I was trying to say a bit. So I'm going to just do a quick thing now and just post up some pictures and explain what I'm saying. But before I get into the blood stains and showing pictures, one thing I wanted to correct from Part 13 was when I was talking about the minimal relevant feature number 3. How does direct contact mechanisms work in terms of forming the 3-dimensional body images? And I don't know, maybe I was drunk or something like that. I have no idea what was going on, but whatever I was rambling on about, I was talking more about the full-length continuous body images, which is part of minimal relevant feature number 4, not really the 3-dimensional aspect. So that was totally out to lunch. What I was trying to say is that direct contact mechanisms naturally can't explain the 3-dimensional nature because it's an all-or-nothing deal. Just like when we looked at some of the artistic mechanisms like powder rubbing on a bas-relief or statue or something like that, these mechanisms are all or nothing. You get ones or zeros in terms of image, right? So, and they're all the same density or darkness. So the Shroud's 3-dimensionality is created by variations in the light to dark or the image color density that we have. And, so the tip of the nose, parts of the body that were closest to the cloth at the time of the encodation, they're the darkest. They have the highest image density. Whereas the further away the body part was at the time of encodation, it's lighter in color. It's less dark. It's lighter or less dense in coloring. And that's what I was trying to say, is that what we have with the shrouded terrain is that there are variations or gradations in this lightness to darkness densities. And these correlate topographically to body to cloth distance at the time of encodation. And that's why we have these three-dimensional images that everyone admits is a scientifically proven fact. It's a minimal relevant feature. If it was a direct contact mechanism, however, we wouldn't get these fine gradations or fine variations in lightness or darkness. And one thing I should say, just so you're not confused, remember body image uniformity as well. I'm not denying that with the three-dimensionality. So if you remember in part 4 of my Shroud series, when I explained three-dimensionality and body image uniformity, so every individual fibril is colored to the exact same degree. One isn't more colored than another. But so what is it that makes the tip of the nose darker than the top of the cheek, the lower cheek, or something like that? Well, it's because that there's more, the density of colored fibrils in that area is higher than in other areas, and that's what creates this darker and lighter areas that represents topographical information in terms of body to cloth distances of that body part. With that said, with a direct contact mechanism, look, it's all or nothing. You're either touching it, everything will be colored the exact same, whether they're touching it. If it's a non-contact zone, then it's zero color, nothing. You wouldn't get fine gradations whereby certain parts are darker, then slightly less dark, and then slightly lesser and lesser dark until you get to the lightest thing based on the furthest body part. And look, even if you did somehow come up with some way to get darker and variations in darker and lighter images, maybe there's more sweat in one area of the body or something. I don't know how you would explain that or something. And it definitely wouldn't lead to body image uniformity if that was the case. But let's just say on the three-dimensional, somehow you can get variations in color density or something like that. It would still be impossible to get those color densities to correlate precisely to body to cloth distances to convey true topographical or three-dimensional information onto the Shroud Man. You wouldn't get that correlation. Yeah, number one, it would be impossible to get variations in colors while preserving body image uniformity. You would just have this all or nothing result or effect, which wouldn't convey 3D info. But even if you did somehow come up with a way to get variations in color density, there's no way that you could get through a direct contact mechanism, get that to correlate to topographical information in terms of body to cloth distance information being encoded on the Shroud. So it's just scientifically impossible for direct contact to work here. But yet the Shroud of Turin does have this gradation in light to dark image density, colors and that sort of thing. And that's what gives us that topographical information to do body to cloth distances and create the three-dimensional images. That's impossible to occur with direct contact mechanisms. So that's what I was trying to say there, if that makes sense. Okay, great. So just a couple things about the blood stains that I covered in part 13. Just wanted to go over some pictures that I was talking about there and give you kind of visual images of what I was talking about, because it was a lot of talking without any helpful illustrations. So let's do that right now. Okay, so the first picture that I'm posting up here for you guys is basically just showing that, I was talking about how the bloodstains are in pristine condition. They actually, for the most, by and large, show up in the actual form, shape, size, and location as they would congeal on human skin if they flowed and congealed onto human skin. So this you can kind of make out those blood flow patterns and the shapes and just kind of get a sense of, there's no evidence of smearing, damage, alteration, or that sort of thing on it, on these things. So that's what I wanted you guys to see in this part. The next picture, you can see, this is the chest wound. So you can see the front image, and then there's on the reverse. So this shows how the bloodstains are embedded in the cloth. They soaked down and they show up in the same size and shape on the other reverse side of the cloth. So this proves that it must have been transferred as a liquid because it's soaked right through from the front side to the back side there. The next picture that I want you guys to see here, so this is of the small, this is on the dorsal side image. It's the small of the back, that blood belt that we kind of mentioned there, and you can see the horizontal flow of the blood belt. And this is on the arched small of the back. Given the shroudman's position in rigor mortis, this is a non-contact area. It would not be making direct contact with the shroud. And yet you can see from the image, it's embedded into the cloth. It shows up on the reverse side in the same shape and size on the reverse side of the cloth, meaning it was a liquid and it was entrenched in there. And like I said, this is problematic for direct contact. How did this blood stain get encoded when it wouldn't have been touching a naturally draped cloth? The back would have been arched up and away, given the position of the pointed toes down and one knees kind of bent up a little bit. This wouldn't be touching the small of the back, unless some kind of pressure you tied the body to it or something like that and forced the cloth to touch the small of the back, thereby encoding this through direct contact. But if that were to happen, wouldn't there be some kind of smearing that would take place or alteration of the blood stains that would be evident? These look pristine. They don't look like they've been smudged or fudged or at all in any way, or altered or damaged in any kind of way. And pressure would do that, especially if this was pressed. Just again, think of a blood wound and you put a band-aid and you put pressure there, you get a bloody blob. You don't get distinct pristine blood stains in these non-contact areas, and to make them contact areas you have to apply pressure, and then you get that bloody blob, indistinct blob, or some kind of smearing, some kind of alteration or damage that would be evident. The next picture is just a quick picture of the back of the man's head. I mentioned there's about 20 distinct blood flows that have been counted on the back of the shroudman's head with the crown of thorns. This is just a quick picture of that, but yeah, you guys can look at that later on. Okay, so the next picture is kind of giving you a little bit of details. So this is on plastic. It's a drop of human blood showing the clotting process on a piece of clear plastic, as was done in the experiments of Pierre Barbet before and that sort of thing. So basically in the upper left, you can see what the blood looked like when it was immediately taken after it was placed onto the plastic sheet. You can see pictures were taken every 2 minutes after that. After about 10 minutes, on the lower right, this is about 10 minutes later, you can see the clotting, the upraised edges around, slightly darker perimeter around the blood clot there, and the upraised edges. So this is on plastic. This is what blood does. Within 10 minutes, it's dry. It won't transfer onto cloths or stuff like that, but gives you an idea of the clotting process. The next picture that you're seeing, so now we're going on to human skin and showing the process there. So in the top left, that's when it was immediately placed on. The drop of blood was immediately, they used a pin to prick the tip of the finger. So that's what we're looking at here. And then by the bottom right, it's fully dried, it's congealed. There's slightly upraised edges, and you can see the wrinkling of the skin as it's shrinking in, spouting out the serum retraction rings, the serum from the blood, which leaves the serum retraction rings, and that pulls the skin and wrinkles it a bit. You can see the upraised edges there. Looks like a slightly darker perimeter. But pictures in this thing were taken every minute up until 11 minutes afterwards. The blood was fully dry, won't transfer to a cloth. So within 11 minutes, the blood clots wouldn't be transferable. Okay, so the next picture that we're going to look at is blood on linen. And this is just normal blood, uncoagulated. So this is talking about the enduring redness counter feature of the Shroud of Turin. So in the show, on direct contact, I mentioned that one of the problems is this enduring redness. Blood will turn dark, black, brown or black over time. And you can see in this picture, so here's when it's at 49 seconds after it's dropped on linen, it's bright red. And then as we go, it starts turning darker and darker in color. And then here's this picture where it's like really brown. This is 63 days later, it's totally brown and black. But yet the Shroud of Turin is centuries old, and it's still the blood is still red. It's not brown or dark brown or black as we would expect, and that requires explanation. Now, they did find in their other experiments that adding an anticoagulant does provide more of a reddish tint, so that lasts longer, that reddish tint, but it's still not to the same degree as we find with the Shroud of Turin, which has a carmine coloring to it, kind of a purplish red color to it. Okay, so the next image that you're looking at, so these are with painted images. You can see that, especially the one on the left, there's like that dark perimeter with a big brush, whereas with a smaller brush, it doesn't have the dark perimeters. So you can see that in these images. It's also hard to create. Like on the two left ones, they're kind of blobby and indistinct. So you can see they had trouble producing well-crafted images like we see with the Shroud's pristine bloodstains. Whereas when they used a smaller brush, okay, they could get better shapes and stuff like that. But as I mentioned on the show, they lack that dark perimeter or border around it when they use the smaller brush. So there was that trade-off there, you know, using a smaller brush and those techniques, you're able to get more definable images comparable to the Shroud, but they don't have the dark perimeters around the bloodstains like the Shroud of Turin does. The Shroud's bloodstains do. Whereas if you use a larger brush, you get these indefinable blobs, or, you know, they're not really definable shapes, or like the Shroud's bloodstains in pristine condition as it flowed and congealed on human skin. But you do get these darker perimeters around, just like we have with the Shroud of Turin. So that's an interesting contrast there. Depending on what technique you use, there seems to be a trade-off. You can't get both like we have with the Shroud of Turin. And that's evident on the picture that you were looking at. The next image shows the blood, when it has an anticoagulant in it, it cracks and that sort of thing. And that might support a skeptic. If you say that Jesus' clotting factors were depleted during his time scourging and crucifixion, so that's why we put the anticoagulant in to kind of mimic Jesus's blood coagulation process, or clotting factors were diminished or depleted to some extent because of what he'd been through. Well, if that was the case, then maybe the blood was kind of cracking like this, and that could help to explain why some of it flaked off over the centuries, and or perhaps all of it, and that sort of thing, as a lot of people would say. But again, I find that problematic to say that it all flaked off. All right, so the next picture that you guys are going to be looking at is from the experiments of testing direct contact specifically. And this is where they put pig's blood onto a human being, a human's skin down the inner part of his arm, and then linen was pressed lightly onto the skin about 30 minutes after the blood was put on the arm. And when they did this in the first round, the picture that you're seeing here, the blood was totally dry. No transfer took place. And they say this was surprising because the air temperature was only 7.2 degrees Celsius, or if you're an American, 45 degrees Fahrenheit. And there was only a slight breeze. So this was shocking that, you know, no transfer was able to happen at the 30-minute mark. So you can see that the picture you're looking at here first is his arm at the 15-minute mark. One thing I will say with the 30 minutes, so it was completely dry on human skin. Some blood droplets on the human hairs were still a little wet, even after 30 minutes. So understand that. So that could be some smearing or leading to some alteration or that sort of thing in the bloodstains we see, yet that's not evident on the Shroud of Turin. So yeah, here's going with the same experiments. You can see the arm after 30 minutes is totally dry to the touch. It's not transferred, it's clotted and that sort of thing. It won't transfer to the linen. And also in the next picture, so this is really important. Remember, this shows the wrinkling. As the blood clots, it grabs the skin. As it spews out its serum and retracts, it grabs the skin, and that causes it to wrinkle. And remember, they scientifically proved that anything, I think 0.9 millimeters deep or more, means that the blood in those valleys or in those wrinkles will not be transferred to the linen cloth at all. There's zero transfer. They won't make contact. So you can see the severe wrinkling here just from this one blood stain. Imagine being covered in blood stains. You would be wrinkled all over. And this would lead to discontinuous blood stains because those blood stains wouldn't make contact with the cloth. I mean, this is way more than just a 0.9 millimeter wrinkle or depth in terms of the wrinkles here. But yet the Shroud's bloodstains are continuous. There are no discontinuities in it, despite scientifically proving that there would be a lot of wrinkles here. So that's an interesting aspect to get from this picture here. Now, one thing I should mention, that's it for the pictures, but don't forget there are anticoagulant aspects to the blood. So if the body's blood clotting process was depleted or diminished in some way, that might lead to the blood stains being wetter longer than 30 minutes or that sort of thing. Again, they transferred it in various conditions, and it depends on the environment, how humid, how moist it is. But ultimately, they seem to have found that, yeah, it will be dry within about 30 minutes regardless of the conditions, and it will lead to some severe wrinkling that's caused. So that's sort of a problem here. That's it for the pictures. All of these pictures, I do want to say, so thank you to Luigi Garlascelli's and their paper in terms of the pictures for the experiments to help you guys. And also to Mark Antinacci and Dr. Arthur Lind for sharing these pictures with you in terms of their experiments, in terms of blood transfer and that sort of thing. But I think it's important that I use these images because if you haven't read the articles on my blog site, it kind of helps you put a visual image to what I'm talking about here. So I hope that helps. There are more pictures that I didn't include, so please, if you really want to look into this, go to my blog site. All of these articles are there for free in terms of the blood pattern analysis, as well as Mark Antinacci and Dr. Arthur Lind's experiments on the blood stain. So you can see them in context and give them the credit. They deserve that. But yeah, other than that's it for this show. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. Under an hour and a half, that's awesome for this supplemental show. I have next show, I guess, will be the Dr. Egel German show with David Russell on Torah Observant Christianity. I'll post that up next week. Otherwise, if you want to see it early, it's being recorded on Monday, so I don't know when. Monday, January 17th. So hopefully David Russell will have that up on Pora for you guys earlier than I will. But yeah, it should be a good show. In terms of the Shroud series, so the next thing I'm going to be finally I'm done with direct contact. I covered the Bpa analysis and a lot of the information on blood. I tried to be thorough in terms of painting, direct contact, and a hybrid approach of direct contact plus painting, and showed that none of those naturalistic mechanisms work on a balance of probabilities to explain the bloodstains, thereby proving we probably need an extraordinary or miraculous mechanism. But yeah, going forward with the rest of the ordinary naturalistic hypotheses, I'm not going to go into as much detail about the bloodstains. I figure I've covered it in part 13 and part 13b here, so I'll reference you guys back. But primarily we'll be focused on the body images in studying the next mechanisms, which will be gas diffusion, which will be the first one on the agenda. So there's two gas diffusion mechanisms. There's the vapograph hypothesis of Paul Vignon, and then there's the Maillard reaction by Dr. Stirp scientist, Dr. Ray Rogers. So we're going to be looking at those and seeing do those work? How do those do in terms of explaining the Shroud's body images and images that we see on the Shroud? All right, have a great week, everybody. Take care.